1989, the quiet town of Millstone was shattered by a single crime: the murder of a young schoolteacher named Claire Benton. Within days, police arrested Ethan Miles, a gentle local mechanic with no criminal record and no motive. The evidence was thin, the investigation rushed, and the town desperate for answers. Labeled a monster, Ethan was sentenced to life in prison for a murder he didn't commit. For 30 long years, he lived behind bars, forgotten by the world, until Laura Keene, a determined investigator, reopened his case and uncovered the truth that would shake the justice system to its core. This is the haunting story of the innocent man who spent 30 years in prison. A story of lies, loss, and the long road to redemption. It was the kind of morning that started quietly, without warning of the tragedy that would soon shake the town of Millstone. The streets were still damp from the night's rain, the sun barely stretching its first rays over the rows of painted houses. Birds chirped on telephone wires, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery at the corner. For years, Millstone had been the kind of place where nothing ever truly happened. No secrets, no scandals, no mysteries. That illusion ended the morning Claire Benton's body was found in her apartment. Claire had been a schoolteacher, known for her bright laugh and gentle manner. When she didn't show up to class that morning, a neighbor went to check on her. The door was unlocked. Inside, the silence was unnatural, heavy. A cup had fallen from the counter. A chair was tipped over, and the radio was still humming faintly in the background. In her small living room, Claire lay motionless. The scene didn't make sense to anyone who saw it. Millstone had never seen a crime like this before. Within minutes, the street outside her building filled with flashing lights. Police cars blocked the road, officers whispered among themselves, and neighbors gathered in clusters trying to understand what had happened. People were afraid, but curiosity was stronger. Rumors spread faster than facts ever could. Some said it was a burglary gone wrong. Others whispered about a jealous ex-lover. Nobody had proof, but everyone had an opinion. Ethan Miles's name came up almost immediately. He was a local mechanic who had fixed Claire's car the week before. A quiet man, polite but distant, who lived alone on the edge of town. Someone mentioned seeing him near Claire's place a few evenings before. That was all it took for suspicion to bloom. When detectives found a glass with his fingerprints on it inside her apartment, it sealed his fate in the public's eyes. They didn't care that he'd been there only to help her after her car broke down. In their minds, fingerprints meant guilt. By that afternoon, Ethan's photo was on the news. Reporters called it a swift development. The sheriff's office held a press briefing where they announced that a suspect had been detained. No one questioned how fast it all happened or why. The town wanted someone to blame, someone to make the fear go away. And Ethan Miles fit the role perfectly, a man without close friends, with no one to defend him. When they came for him, he didn't resist. He was confused more than angry, asking questions that no one answered. Cameras followed as he was led away in handcuffs, his face pale and expressionless. By nightfall, everyone in Millstone had seen the image of the killer. Children were told not to talk to strangers, shopkeepers whispered behind counters, and families double-locked their doors. That night, as rain began to fall again, Ethan sat alone in a holding cell, staring at the wall, trying to understand how his ordinary life had turned into a nightmare in just one day. Outside, the town finally felt safe again, but only because they believed the monster was behind bars. No one stopped to wonder if they had caught the wrong man. The courthouse was packed from the moment the doors opened. People who had never spoken to Claire Benton suddenly wanted to witness the end of her story. The trial became an event, the biggest thing to happen in Millstone in decades. Reporters filled the benches, sketch artists captured every flicker of emotion, and whispers floated through the air like static. The prosecution promised justice, the defense begged for fairness, but it was clear from the start that the verdict had already been written in the hearts of those who came to watch. Ethan Miles sat at the defense table in a plain suit, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the polished wood floor. He couldn't understand how things had spiraled so quickly. The prosecution built their case on a handful of circumstantial details, but they presented them with the confidence of absolute truth. His fingerprints on the glass were treated as undeniable proof. The strand of hair near the body was said to likely belong to him, though it was never scientifically confirmed. And then there was the witness, an uneasy man who claimed to have seen Ethan walking near Claire's apartment the night she died. The jury leaned forward as he spoke, hungry for certainty in a case full of uncertainty. Ethan's lawyer tried to explain that there was no motive, no history of violence, no direct link that proved guilt. But logic had no place in a trial built on fear and emotion. The town wanted someone to pay, and Ethan's quiet, isolated life made him the perfect target. When the prosecutor called him a jealous man who couldn't handle rejection, the room buzzed with murmurs. It didn't matter that no one had ever seen Ethan and Claire together in that way. The story sounded believable enough to satisfy the crowd. The days dragged on in a blur of testimonies, photographs, and speculation. Reporters twisted every detail into sensational headlines. To the outside world, Ethan became the symbol of hidden darkness, a reminder that even in a peaceful town, evil could wear a familiar face. By the time the defense presented its final argument, no one was listening. The courtroom wasn't looking for truth anymore. It wanted closure. When the jury left to deliberate, the silence in the room was suffocating. Ethan sat still, his mind empty. He imagined himself back in his workshop, grease on his hands, the sound of tools clicking against metal. He imagined walking home through quiet streets without stares or whispers, but those memories felt like they belonged to someone else. 3 hours later, the jury returned. The foreman stood, unfolded a piece of paper, and spoke a single word that shattered everything. Guilty. Gasps filled the room. Ethan didn't move. His lawyer lowered his head. Across the aisle, Claire's family cried softly, believing justice had been done. The judge's gavel came down with finality. Ethan Miles was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside, cameras flashed as the news spread. Headlines celebrated the swift end to the town's tragedy. But in that rush to move on, no one realized that Millstone had just created another one, a tragedy that would take 30 years to uncover. The walls of the prison were higher than they looked from the outside. Inside, everything was gray. The floors, the uniforms, the sky that peeked through narrow windows. The first night Ethan Miles spent there was the longest of his life. The cell was small, barely enough space for the narrow bed, a metal sink, and a single shelf. The door slammed shut with a sound that echoed through his bones. It wasn't just the sound of metal. It was the sound of a life ending. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Ethan learned quickly how to survive inside. He kept his head down, avoided arguments, and did what he was told. Some prisoners shouted at him, calling him names from stories they had heard on the news. Others ignored him completely. He became invisible, which suited him fine. He didn't want trouble. He just wanted to breathe and make it through each day. He got a job in the prison workshop, repairing old furniture and broken tools. It was mechanical, repetitive work that helped keep his mind occupied. In those hours, he could almost pretend he was back in his garage, fixing engines, wiping his hands on a rag, waiting for customers to drop by. But every time he looked up, the barbed wire reminded him that freedom was gone. The workshop wasn't a garage, it was a cage with hammers. At night, the noise never stopped. Metal doors slammed, voices rose in anger, guards shouted commands, and footsteps echoed endlessly down the corridor. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of open roads and his mother's voice. In those dreams, he wasn't a criminal. He was just Ethan, the man who fixed cars and minded his own business. But each morning, the cold air of reality returned. Letters were his only connection to the world beyond those walls. For years, his mother wrote to him every week, her handwriting neat and steady. She never doubted his innocence, not for a moment. Her letter spoke of faith and patience, urging him to hold on. He wrote back about his days, leaving out the worst parts so she wouldn't worry. Her letter slowed over time, then stopped completely. The next one he received was not from her. It was from a priest informing him that she had passed away. Ethan didn't cry. He sat on his bed staring at the wall until the cell lights went out. The pain was too deep for tears. The thought that she died believing in him was the only thing that kept him from breaking. Years blurred together after that. Guards changed, inmates came and went, but Ethan remained. He aged quietly, his hair turning gray, his back bending slightly from years of hard labor. The world outside moved on without him. Television reports mentioned new inventions, new laws, even new forms of justice that used science to find the truth. But none of it mattered behind those walls. To the system, Ethan Miles was just another number, another name on a file collecting dust in an archive. And then, one ordinary morning, a guard called his name for a meeting with a visitor, a name he didn't recognize. It was the first spark of something different, something that might finally break the silence of 30 years. The woman who walked into the visiting room introduced herself as Laura Keene, an investigator who reviewed old convictions. She sat across from Ethan with a folder full of papers and photographs, her eyes sharp but kind. Ethan didn't know what to expect. People had come and gone over the years, law students, charity workers, reporters, but no one had ever truly listened. Laura was different. She spoke little, asked few questions, and mostly studied him as if trying to see the man behind the headlines. When she left, she promised to look deeper into his case. Ethan didn't let himself believe her. He had learned not to hope. Laura returned weeks later with something he hadn't heard in decades: news. She had found errors in the original police report, inconsistencies that had been ignored during his trial. One line stood out to her, a note about unidentified fingerprints found at the scene that were never compared to anyone. The evidence had been stored in a county warehouse untouched for 30 years. Laura filed a request to have it reopened and tested with modern technology. Months passed before results came back. The hair once said to belong to Ethan was not his. The fingerprints matched another man, a known burglar with a violent history who had been operating in the same area at the time of Claire Benton's death. He had died in prison years ago, but his record remained. Laura cross-referenced police files and found that his crimes shared an identical pattern: late-night break-ins, stolen valuables, and sometimes violent encounters when victims resisted. Claire's case fit the same pattern perfectly. The deeper Laura dug, the worse it looked for those who had investigated Ethan's case. Witness statements were inconsistent, reports had been rewritten, and one of the officers admitted years later that the department had been under pressure to solve the crime quickly. A frightened town had needed an answer, and Ethan had been the easiest one to give them. Laura gathered her findings and contacted a legal organization that specialized in wrongful convictions. Together they built a petition for retrial based on the new DNA evidence. It took months of hearings, paperwork, and appeals before the state finally agreed to reopen the case. Ethan was brought to court once again, older and thinner, his hair white, his eyes quiet but unbroken. The courtroom looked different now. The once curious crowd was replaced by journalists with microphones, recording what they now called a possible miscarriage of justice. Laura presented the evidence carefully. Each document, each test result, each piece of forgotten truth. The judge listened in silence. When the final words were read, the courtroom held its breath. Ethan Miles was declared innocent. The conviction was overturned. The sound in the room wasn't cheering but quiet disbelief. After 3 decades, the lie had finally collapsed. Ethan sat motionless, his hands folded on the table. He didn't smile or cry. He simply closed his eyes as though waking from a long nightmare. The bars, the whispers, the years, they were all behind him now. But freedom, after so much time, felt like something he would need to learn all over again. When the gates finally opened, Ethan stepped out into a world that had forgotten him. The air smelled different, cleaner somehow, but sharper too, filled with sounds and sights that felt almost unreal. Cars moved silently, screens glowed everywhere, and people walked past him without looking up. The last time he had seen the outside world, payphones still stood on corners and cameras used film. Now everything was bright and fast and strange. A small crowd waited beyond the fence, reporters, camera crews, and officials holding folders. They spoke in polite tones, eager for a quote, a smile, something to turn into a headline. Ethan said nothing. His lawyer handled the questions, thanking those who had helped prove his innocence. Ethan only wanted quiet. He turned down interviews, refused to sign any deals, and asked for a single thing: a ride to the town he had left behind 30 years earlier. Millstone looked smaller when he returned. The shop where he used to work was gone, replaced by a cafe with glass walls. The streets were smoother, the trees taller. No one recognized him, but a few stared at the older man walking slowly down the pavement, his expression calm yet distant. Some remembered the name, whispered about it when they thought he couldn't hear. Ethan didn't mind. The whispers were softer than they used to be. He was given compensation from the state, a large sum meant to make up for the lost years. But money couldn't buy back the moments he had missed. Birthdays, sunsets, his mother's voice. He bought a small house near the edge of town, surrounded by open fields. It was quiet there, He spent his mornings tending a small garden, his afternoons reading. The silence was not like prison silence. It was peaceful, forgiving. Sometimes letters arrived from strangers who had read about his story. They wrote of anger and sympathy, of guilt for having believed in a system that failed him. Ethan read each one carefully, then folded them into a drawer. He didn't hold anger anymore. It would have been easy to hate the people who had destroyed his life, but hate was just another kind of prison. He had lost too much time already. He visited the cemetery every week, bringing a single flower to his mother's grave. The headstone was worn, the letters faint, but he knew every curve of her name by heart. Standing there, he spoke quietly about his days, about how the truth had finally come. It didn't matter that no one could hear him. The peace he felt in those moments was enough. Years passed slowly, but he never left Millstone again. He volunteered at the town library, helping children learn to read, teaching them to be curious, to ask questions, to never believe something just because everyone else does. They knew him only as Mr. Miles, the quiet man with kind eyes. When people spoke of him now, they no longer used the word killer. They called him the man who forgave. And though the years behind bars could never be erased, Ethan found a kind of freedom deeper than any courtroom could give, the freedom to live without bitterness, to wake each day and know that the truth had finally set him free. 30 years, 3 full decades was the price Ethan Miles paid for a crime he never committed. His story is not just about injustice, it's about how truth can be buried beneath fear, how evidence can be ignored, and how one person's determination can change everything. Ethan lost his youth, his family and his time, but not his humanity. When the truth finally came to light, he didn't seek revenge. Instead, he chose peace, forgiveness, and the quiet dignity of starting over. His courage reminds us that justice isn't about punishment, it's about truth. Claire Benton's death took one innocent life and destroyed another. Sheriff Hayes's haste, Robert Lane's lies, and the system's failure built a tragedy that lasted a lifetime. But Laura Keene's persistence showed that even after decades of silence, the truth can still find a voice. Today, Ethan's story stands as a warning and a lesson. It reminds the world that justice rushed is justice denied, and that every case, no matter how simple it seems, deserves patience, honesty, and compassion. He walked out of prison an old man, but not a broken one. In the soft light of freedom, Ethan Miles proved that even after 30 years of darkness, the human spirit can still rise, still forgive, and still find peace.